Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a truly fascinating sermon that unpacks some deep paradoxes about justification, earthly status, and spiritual reality. We'll be doing this by examining the well-known parable of the rich man and Lazarus from Luke chapter 16. And honestly, what's so incredible about this source material is how it takes a familiar, ancient story and completely turns our modern obsession with status, wealth, and public approval entirely on its head. Right out of the gate, Jesus establishes the entire theological framework with this direct, piercing accusation to the Pharisees. He says, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts, for what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." Now, the sermon points out something really crucial here. Jesus isn't necessarily talking about them trying to earn eternal salvation through good works. Instead, he's calling them out for something much more insidious. They were literally turning the approval of other people into their God. So let's dive into section 1, the trap of human approval. To really grasp what's going on with this trap, we have to talk about justification. It's a big word, but basically, it's the act of being declared righteous or innocent. The key contrast made in the sermon, though, is the huge difference between being justified before God versus being justified before men. You see, the Pharisees weren't just trying to check religious boxes to get into heaven. They were playing to the crowd. They had made a literal idol out of public approval, desperately seeking to be declared righteous and flawless by society standards, completely ignoring God's standards. And this dynamic brilliantly illustrates the earthly conflict in the parable. Imagine the scene. On one side, you have the rich man. He's clothed in purple and fine linen, eating lavish feasts and holding an incredibly high societal status. He's the ultimate picture of human approval. On the exact opposite side, you have Lazarus, an unclean beggar with oozing sores, surrounded by scavenging dogs, viewed by everyone as an absolute abomination. The sermon highlights something profound about this setup. The rich man ignores Lazarus not just out of simple everyday greed, but to preserve his own high status. Think about it. To associate with an unclean beggar would ruin his reputation, so he actively disobeys God's law to care for the poor just to maintain his flawless approval ratings among men. In the world's eyes, the rich man is the innocent, worthy one. Which brings us to section 2, the great spiritual reversal. Boom! The moment death occurs, the narrative drastically flips. The spiritual reality turns out to be the exact opposite of the visible reality. Suddenly, the rich man is judged totally guilty, sent to hell, and his societal righteousness is revealed to be totally false. Meanwhile, Lazarus, the absolute lowest outcast, is judged innocent and is carried by angels to Abraham's side in heaven. The rich man loses absolutely everything. The beggar gains eternal comfort. It's a complete, shocking inversion of the earthly status quo. Now, looking at this shocking reversal, you might be wondering, is this just cosmic karma? Is God just balancing the scales here because Lazarus had a terrible earthly life and the rich man had an awesome one? The answer to that is a resounding no. The sermon explicitly rejects the whole karma interpretation. The rich man wasn't condemned simply because he happened to be rich and comfortable. He was condemned because his pursuit of status and his so-called earthly righteousness were actually an abomination to God. By sacrificing his obedience to God on the altar of human approval, he was left with absolutely nothing but his own false righteousness, which the text vividly refers to as filthy rags. So, if it wasn't karma, how was Lazarus justified? Well, it definitely wasn't because he was poor. After all, he goes straight to the side of Abraham, who was historically very wealthy. Rather, Lazarus was justified exactly the same way Abraham was. He believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness. He was justified solely by his faith, not by his lack of earthly status or some weird cosmic balancing act. Let's move on to section 3, Christ, the true rich man. Spiritually speaking, the pastor argues that this entire parable actually maps perfectly onto the human condition. It's like a giant metaphor. All of humanity, we are the unclean beggar. We're barred from God's presence by sin, sitting there with incredibly low spiritual status. Our only hope is if a compassionate rescuer, a truly wealthy man, chooses to save us. And that rescuer is Jesus Christ, whom the sermon calls the true rich man. We all start out sitting outside the gate, totally separated from God. But through Christ, we are given heavenly riches, which means we get to share in his righteousness and salvation. The sermon outlines Christ's earthly ministry by showing how he did the exact opposite of the rich man in the story. Seriously, look at the contrast. Jesus literally left his heavenly status to come down and mingle with unworthy sinners. He completely ignored the approval of men. In fact, the more he pleased God, the more society hated him. and ultimately he was stripped of his clothing and died a shameful, guilty death outside the camp. He actively, willingly embraced the exact low status that the parable's rich man so desperately tried to avoid. This whole idea is captured in this absolutely profound paradox. He exalts you with his shame. He makes you rich by his poverty. The pastor describes this beautiful divine exchange where Jesus willingly takes on the world's shame and the punishment of sinners, all in order to give humanity his heavenly status. He didn't hoard his wealth. He looked at the beggars stranded outside the gate and decided to share everything he had. So what does this mean for our everyday lives? Let's get into section 4, vocation and worldly suffering. The pastor charges the congregation to go out into their daily roles, whether that's as husbands, wives, or parents, and act as rich men who have already been given the ultimate riches by Christ. Because your status is entirely secure in God, you are called to suffer shame for your neighbors. You're told to love and serve your families according to God's teaching, even when society gives you absolutely zero praise for it, or even worse, when society actively labels you as mean, stupid, or intolerant. It's kind of a hard pill to swallow, but the sermon makes it clear the Christian life is fundamentally a life of suffering, where believers might only see failure in the world's eyes and receive no true societal reward. It's a sobering reminder that seeking justification before God often means you literally have to abandon your justification before men. You just can't serve both. But the flip side is, if you are completely secure in God's approval, you don't need to frantically run around chasing the world's applause anymore. Let's wrap this up with section 5, finding hope in the end. The pastor realistically and bravely shifts gears here to acknowledge the very real steps of aging that most of us are going to face. We're talking about physical and mental deterioration, reaching a point where you might look and feel just as undesirable or burdensome as Lazarus did, lying outside those gates. Maybe losing your memory, failing to even recognize the people caring for you, and facing the reality of dying in a nursing home surrounded by strangers. It is a really stark reality check that almost all of us will eventually lose our earthly status completely and become totally dependent on others. But here is the incredibly good news. Even in the deepest depths of dementia, physical decay, or total isolation, the sermon offers this completely triumphant comfort. It says, even then, when your standing before men is at its lowest, when no one cares, you will still be highly esteemed in the sight of God because of Jesus Christ. The pastor reassures everyone listening that regardless of how broken your earthly state becomes, on account of Christ, you remain perfectly innocent and perfectly worthy. So as we conclude this explainer, I want to leave you with the ultimate tension of this text. In a world that is absolutely obsessed with status, whose approval are you ultimately seeking? Are you exhausting yourself day in and day out chasing the fleeting applause of the visible world, just like the rich man? Or are you resting in the eternal justification of the invisible one? It's a profound question, and it really challenges the very foundation of how we choose to live our lives. Thanks so much for diving into this with me today, and keep exploring.